Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we explore the darkest and most chilling tales from around the world. Tonight, we venture into the heart of winter, uncovering 10 terrifying snow horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. From ghostly figures in Canadian forests to the haunting cries of Yuki-onna in Japan, these tales reveal the icy grip of fear hidden in snow-covered landscapes. Turn down the lights, grab a blanket, and prepare for a journey into the haunting chill of winter's most mysterious legends. Story number 1. The Yeti. The Himalayas are a place of extremes, an unforgiving land of jagged peaks, endless snow, and a silence so profound it feels alive. People who've been there talk about its beauty, its majesty, but they don't talk about the shadows, about what might be watching from the icy crags, about what might be waiting. I didn't believe the stories about the Yeti when we set out for our trek in Nepal. To me, it was just another legend, a creature born from fear and isolation, a figment of the human mind. But now, I know better. It was late November when we began the climb. Our group consisted of 6 people: me, my best friend Scott, our guide Ram, and 3 others: Anna, Jake, and Laura. We were experienced hikers, all of us, but the Himalayas were unlike anything we'd tackled before. Ram warned us about the dangers: avalanches, frostbite, the thin air. He didn't mention the Yeti, but the villagers we met along the way did. They called it Mete, the man of the snow. Their warnings were vague, just whispers about staying close to camp, about not wandering alone. I dismissed them as superstition. Scott even laughed about it, calling it the Himalayan Bigfoot. We didn't laugh for long. The first few days of the trek were grueling but uneventful. The air grew thinner, the cold sharper, and the terrain more treacherous as we climbed higher. The nights were long, the wind howling like a living thing. But it wasn't until the 4th night that the unease set in. We were camped near a steep ridge, the snow around us glowing faintly under the pale light of the moon. It was cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt, and the air carried a strange, metallic tang. After dinner, we crawled into our tents, the sound of the wind lulling us into a fitful sleep. And then came the howl. It was distant at first, almost drowned out by the wind, but it grew louder, closer. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest, primal and otherworldly. "Did you hear that?" Anna whispered from the next tent. "Probably just the wind," Scott mumbled, though his voice trembled. But it wasn't the wind. The howl came again, followed by a strange silence. The wind had stopped, the air thick and oppressive. I could hear my own heartbeat, my breath fogging the freezing air. And then, faintly, the crunch of snow, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low growl, deep and menacing, came from just outside my tent. "Who's out there?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The growl turned into a snarl, and something scraped against the fabric of the tent. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to look, to see what was out there, but my body wouldn't move. Fear held me in place, and then it was gone. The wind picked up again, the silence broken, and I heard Scott unzip his tent. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I don't know," I said, stepping out into the cold. The others joined us, their faces pale and drawn. Ram was the last to emerge, his expression grim. "We need to stay close," he said, his voice low. "Do not wander." The next morning, the camp was a mess. The food supplies were gone, and one of the tents had been ripped open. But it was the footprints that froze us in place. Massive, clearly defined prints in the snow, each one at least 2 feet long. They led from the edge of the camp to the forest below, disappearing into the shadows. "This has to be a joke," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just a bear, right? No bear walks like that," Ram said, pointing to the tracks. This is something else. None of us had an answer. That night, the fear set in. The wind was stronger, the cold biting deeper, but it wasn't the elements that kept us awake. It was the feeling of being watched. We kept the fire burning as long as we could, the flames casting flickering shadows across the snow. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of the wind, set us on edge. And then, just before midnight, Anna screamed. I turned to see her pointing toward the ridge above us. My blood ran cold. A figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight, tall and impossibly large. His body was covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to blend into the shadows, and its arms hung low, nearly reaching the ground. But it was the eyes that terrified me, two burning red orbs, glowing like embers in the dark. It's watching us, Anna whispered, her voice trembling. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring down at us, its presence heavy and oppressive. And then it howled, a sound so loud and guttural it made the ground beneath us tremble. Get in the tents, Ram shouted, grabbing a flare gun. The rest of us scrambled inside, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The creature didn't leave. We could hear it circling the camp, its growls vibrating through the ground. At one point, something heavy slammed into one of the tents, nearly collapsing it. I thought I heard it breathing, the sound low and wet, like the rasp of a dying animal. We huddled together, clutching whatever we could find, knives, flashlights, anything that felt like a weapon. But none of it would have made a difference. By dawn, the creature was gone. The camp was in ruins, the tents shredded, the snow stained with blood. One of the flares had been fired, but Ram wouldn't tell us what he'd seen. It is gone now, was all he said. We packed up what little we had left and started down the mountain, our eyes constantly scanning the shadows. No one spoke. The silence between us was heavier than the snow. I left Nepal a week later, but the memories stayed with me. I still see those glowing red eyes in my dreams, still hear the howls echoing in the dark. People laugh when I tell them the story, call it a bear, a trick of the light, but they didn't see what I saw. The Yeti isn't just a legend, it's real, and it's out there, waiting, and if you ever hear its howl, pray it doesn't find you. Story number 2. The woman in the snow-white cloak. There are places in this world where the line between the living and the dead grows thin. In the frozen mountains of Japan, where the snow buries the earth for months on end, that line all but disappears. That's what the locals told me when I arrived at the small mountain village of Yuzuwa. At the time, I thought it was nothing more than folklore, a story to keep travelers wary of the elements. I don't think that anymore. It was January, the dead of winter, and I was there for the peace. As an author, I often sought out solitude to write, and Yuzuwa seemed perfect, nestled in the shadow of Mount Tanagawa. The village was picturesque, with its wooden houses, steaming onsens, and the ever-present blanket of snow. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by dense forest. The locals were welcoming enough, though they warned me about venturing out after dark. It's not just the cold you need to worry about. One old man told me over a cup of sake at the village inn, the mountains are alive. They watch you, and sometimes they reach out. I laughed it off at the time, but his words stayed with me. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time writing, walking through the snow-covered woods, and soaking in the hot springs. The air was crisp, the landscape breathtaking, and the quiet was exactly what I needed. But on the 4th day, the storm came. It rolled in quickly, the sky darkening as heavy flakes began to fall. By late afternoon, the wind was howling, and the snow was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. I decided to cut my walk short and head back to the cabin. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the forest, her figure almost blending into the blizzard. First, I thought she was a tree, the outline of her white kimono so still it seemed unnatural. But as I moved closer, I saw her face, a pale, almost translucent visage framed by long black hair. She was beautiful in a way that felt unreal, like something out of an ancient painting. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but there was something cold about it, something that made my stomach twist. "Are you okay?" I called, raising my voice over the wind. She didn't answer, just tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locked on mine. The longer I looked, the harder it became to move. It wasn't the cold. I'd been in storms like this before, but something deeper, like my very will was being drained away. I took a step toward her, and she smiled wider. That's when I noticed her feet, or rather, the lack of them. She stood on the snow without leaving a single print, her kimono billowing in the wind, though the snow around her remained undisturbed. My breath caught, forming a cloud that hung in the air between us. She took a step forward, gliding across the snow as if weightless. The closer she came, the colder it got, the air around me freezing so fast I could feel the frost forming on my eyelashes. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but carrying over the storm like a whisper in my mind. Panic set in, and I turned to run. My legs felt like lead, the snow dragging at my boots as the wind whipped around me. Behind me, I heard her laugh, a light, melodic sound that somehow carried more menace than the storm itself. "Don't leave," she called, her voice now as sharp as the ice in the air. "Stay with me." The snow seemed to grow heavier, the drifts rising around me as if the mountain itself were trying to pull me under. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps, my vision narrowing as the cold seeped into my bones. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. The warmth of the fire barely reached me as I struggled to catch my breath. Outside, the wind howled, but her laughter was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her dark eyes, her too wide smile, the way the snow seemed to bend around her. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine, unbroken blanket of snow. But as I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints leading from the forest to my cabin. They stopped just at the door, two perfect impressions in the snow. I left Yuzawa the next day, abandoning the cabin and my plans to write. The locals didn't seem surprised when I told them what happened. One old woman simply nodded and said, "She doesn't usually let people go." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. Story number 3. The Snowman in the Blizzard. Alaska is a land of extremes, stunning beauty, brutal cold, and endless wilderness. It's a place that can inspire awe and terror in equal measure. I moved there for the isolation, for the quiet, for the chance to start over. But now, I can't look at the snow without shivering. Not from the cold, but from the memory of him, the snowman. It happened during the winter of 2014, one of the worst winters in recent memory. The snow was relentless. The winds howled like banshees, and the nights were so long and dark they felt endless. I was living alone in a cabin just outside a small town called Whitehaven. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove, but it was enough for me, or so I thought. The locals had warned me about the winters. The storms here aren't like storms anywhere else. One man told me at the general store, "They'll play tricks on your mind, make you see things that aren't there." But it wasn't my mind playing tricks that night. The storm started late in the afternoon. I was splitting wood out back when the first flakes began to fall, tiny and delicate, carried on a breeze that was already biting. By the time I had the last log stacked, the snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. I hunkered down in the cabin, the wood stove blazing and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. The snow piled up quickly, burying the landscape outside in a blanket of white. I watched from the window as the world disappeared, the trees fading into shadows, and then into nothing. By nightfall, the storm was in full force. The wind rattled the windows, and the snow slammed against the walls like fists. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred on the page. My mind wandering to the stories I'd heard in town. Stories about the snowman. I'd laughed them off at the time. The idea of a giant man made of snow, wandering the wilderness, seemed absurd. But now, sitting alone in that cabin with the storm raging outside, the laughter felt far away. It started with a sound. First, I thought it was just the wind, a faint tapping, like branches brushing against the glass. But it came again, more deliberate this time, a soft, rhythmic knock, like someone rapping their knuckles against the window. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't possible. The snow was too deep, the storm too fierce. No one could be out there. The knocking came again. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the wind howling and the tapping at the glass. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and walked to the window, my legs trembling with each step. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling snow outside. First, I saw nothing, just the storm, the endless white, and then I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet from the cabin, a massive figure half hidden by the snow. First, I thought it was a tree, but then he moved. He was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung at his sides. His body was pale, almost blending into the snow, but his face was what froze me in place. It wasn't a face at all, not really, just too deep, empty sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide, too thin. He stood there, motionless, his head tilted slightly as if he were watching me. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. When I looked back, he was gone. I locked the door and bolted it, my hands shaking. The wind howled louder, and the knocking came again, this time from the back of the cabin. "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, clutching it like a lifeline, and forced myself to look out the back window. He was closer now, standing just at the edge of the porch. The wind whipped around him, but he didn't move. His eyes, or the voids where they should have been, stared straight through the glass, straight at me. "Go away," I shouted, my voice breaking. He didn't move. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The locals had said you couldn't escape him. If you saw him, it was already too late. But they hadn't said what to do. They hadn't said how to make him leave. The knocking stopped. I held my breath, listening to the wind, and then I heard it, a creak, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. I ran to the kitchen, my hands fumbling for the butcher knife on the counter. The cabin was small, and I could hear every sound, the heavy, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor, the creak of the boards as he moved. "Stay back," I whispered, clutching the knife. The footsteps stopped. I waited, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And then, slowly, the door to the kitchen creaked open. He was there, filling the doorway, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. His body was covered in frost, his limbs too long, too thin, and his face, that face, those black, empty eyes stared at me, and his mouth opened, stretching into a silent scream. I don't remember what happened next. I must have passed out, because when I woke up, the storm had passed. The cabin was cold, the wood stove reduced to embers. The front door was open, snow drifting inside, but there were no footprints, no sign of anything or anyone. Outside, the ground was covered in a fresh layer of snow, untouched except for a single set of footprints. They were massive, far too large for any human, and they led from the cabin into the woods. I left Alaska a week later, packed up what little I had and never looked back. People in town asked why I was leaving, but I couldn't tell them. What could I say? That I'd seen the snowman? That he'd been inside my cabin? I don't know what he is. Maybe he's a spirit, a ghost, or something older. All I know is that when the storms come and the wind howls, he's out there. And if you hear the knock at your window, don't open the door. because he's waiting. Story number 4. The ghost on the snowy road. They call it Dead Man's Curve. The locals say the stretch of highway just outside Whitefield, Maine, is cursed. It's not the sharp bend in the road or the icy conditions that make it dangerous. It's what people have seen, or think they've seen. I never believed the stories, not until that night. It was mid-January, the dead of winter, and a storm had rolled in, coating everything in a layer of snow and ice. I'd been visiting my parents for the weekend and was driving back to Portland late Sunday evening. The road was empty, the kind of desolation you only find in rural Maine in winter. Just me, the snow, and the low hum of the radio. Dead Man's Curve came into view, the headlights of my old Subaru catching the snowdrifts piled along the roadside. The windshield wipers scraped back and forth, fighting the steady flurry. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter as the car rounded the bend. That's when I saw him. He stood at the edge of the road, his figure illuminated by the headlights. He was wearing a long, tattered coat, the kind you'd see on a man from decades ago, and a hat that looked equally out of place. His arm was raised, his hand waving, as if signaling for help. I hit the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the icy road. My heart raced as the car came to a stop a few feet away from him. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about helping someone on a night like this. No one should be stranded in the cold. But something about him felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still despite the wind whipping around him. Or maybe it was the way his face was obscured, the shadow of his hat casting his features into darkness. I rolled down the window slightly, the cold air biting at my skin. "Need some help," I called out. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his arms still raised. "Hey," I tried again, louder this time. "Do you need a ride?" Slowly, he lowered his arm and took a step toward the car. My fingers tensed on the steering wheel as he approached. The closer he got, the more uneasy I felt. His clothes looked ancient, caked with frost, and his movements were slow, almost deliberate. But his face was wrong. It was pale, unnaturally so, like the snow itself had drained him of all color. His eyes were dark, sunken pits that seemed to stare straight through me. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp for any human. My stomach twisted as he reached for the passenger door. Panicked, slamming my foot on the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching, the car lurching forward as I sped down the road. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was sitting in the back seat. First, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but as I stared, his pale face came into focus, his dark eyes locking onto mine in the mirror. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there, staring. I swerved, nearly losing control of the car as I turned to look over my shoulder. The back seat was empty. My hands trembled on the wheel as I forced my eyes back to the road. The radio crackled, the faint sound of static filling the car. And then I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. I slammed the radio off, my pulse racing. The temperature in the car plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the windshield. I could see my breath in the air, each exhale ragged and uneven. "Leave me alone," I muttered, my voice shaking. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing in the confined space of the car. "You can't run." The headlights flickered, the engine sputtering as the car slowed to a crawl. I pressed the gas pedal, but the car wouldn't accelerate. Panic set in as the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that filled my head like a swarm of angry bees. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The car roared back to life, the headlights blazing as the heat returned. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent once more. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. The image of that man burned into my mind. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that the storm had played with my senses. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't the first to see him. In the weeks that followed, I started researching the stories about Dead Man's Curve. Dozens of people had reported similar encounters over the years. A man in a tattered coat, waving for help, only to disappear or reappear in the back seat of their cars. Some claimed to have heard his voice. Others felt his icy touch. A few swore they saw him again later, standing outside their homes, watching. I haven't driven that road since, but every now and then, on cold winter nights, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow in the window, a figure standing just beyond the streetlights. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the car, I swear I can feel someone watching me from the back seat. Story number 5. The cry in the Canadian snow. The snow came down in thick, heavy flakes, covering the dense Canadian forest in an eerie silence. My brother, Tom, and I were deep into our annual hunting trip, hours from the nearest town, the kind of isolation we both craved. The plan was simple: a week in the wilderness, just us, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the crisp bite of winter air. It wasn't supposed to end like this. The first 2 days were uneventful, the forest stark and beautiful in its winter cloak. We set up camp near a frozen creek, the dense pines providing a natural windbreak. Nights were long and dark, but the crackling fire and the flask of Whiskey Tom always made the cold bearable. On the third night, the sound began. We were huddled by the fire, our breath misting in the frigid air, when a faint noise reached my ears. First, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, the sound became clearer, a soft, mournful cry carried on the breeze. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Tom looked up from his flask, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, probably a coyote or something." "That doesn't sound like a coyote," I said. The cry came again, louder this time, unmistakably human. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, her voice raw and filled with a pain so visceral it made my chest tighten. "We should check it out," Tom said, grabbing the flashlight. We left the safety of the fire and stepped into the forest, the snow crunching underfoot. The cold was sharper away from the flames, seeping through my jacket and into my bones. The sobbing continued, drawing us deeper into the woods. "Hello," Tom called, his voice echoing through the trees. "Is someone there?" No response, just the sound of crying, growing louder and more desperate. "Maybe she's lost," I said, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. "We can't just leave her out here." Tom nodded, and we pushed forward, the light bouncing off the snow-covered branches. The sound seemed to move, always just out of reach, pulling us deeper into the forest. That's when we saw her. She stood in a small clearing, the snow around her untouched and pristine. She was wearing a long, flowing dress that looked far too thin for the freezing weather, her dark hair falling over her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her back to us. "Ma'am," Tom called, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn to look at us. Something about the way she stood, the unnatural stillness of her body, made my stomach twist. "Hey!" Tom shouted, stepping closer. "Do you need help?" As he moved toward her, the temperature dropped sharply. The air around us became colder than anything I'd ever felt, the kind of cold that burns your lungs and freezes your breath midair. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. And then she turned. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the faint moonlight, but her eyes were black voids, empty and endless. Her mouth opened, and the sound of her crying filled the air, louder and more anguished than before. Tom froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What the hell?" Before he could finish, she screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, a piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The trees around us groaned, their branches bending under the weight of the sound. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Tom's arm. We turned and bolted, the snow flying up around us as we stumbled through the forest. The scream followed us, echoing through the trees, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, hers, impossibly fast, closing the distance. We reached the camp, but the fire had gone out, the clearing eerily quiet. I fumbled for the matches, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike them. When the flames finally caught, the warmth was almost enough to push back the terror clawing at my chest. Almost. What the hell was that? Tom whispered, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I don't know, I said, my voice shaking. But it's not human. The crying started again, louder this time, closer, came from all directions, surrounding us, the sound rising and falling like waves. The shadows at the edge of the firelight seemed to move, twisting and stretching into shapes that didn't belong. And then she was there. She stood just outside the circle of light, her head tilted, her black eyes fixed on us. Her mouth opened, and she let out another scream, the sound so loud it felt like my skull would split. Tom grabbed the shotgun from his pack and fired. The blast echoed through the forest, but when the smoke cleared, she was gone. We didn't wait to see if she'd come back. We grabbed what we could carry and ran, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling as we stumbled through the trees, her cries still echoing in our ears. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. As we sped down the icy road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road, watching us. But the road was empty. We never went back to the boundary waters, never spoke about what happened that night. I still hear her sometimes, though in my dreams, in the quiet moments when the wind is just right. Her cries haunt me, pulling me back to that night, to the endless cold and the dark void of her eyes. If you ever find yourself in the snowy woods of Canada and hear a woman crying in the distance, don't follow the sound. Don't try to help, because some things in the forest aren't meant to be found. And once you see her, she won't let you go. Story number 6. The creature beneath the ice. Winter in Siberia isn't just cold. It's a living thing. The frost clings to your skin. The wind whispers through the endless expanse of snow, and the ice stretches for miles, thick and unyielding. It's beautiful in its way, but it's the kind of beauty that can kill you if you're not careful. I learned that the hard way, during a fishing trip on a frozen lake near Novosibirsk. I wasn't prepared for what we saw or what we lost. It was mid-January, the dead of winter, when my friends convinced me to join them. There were 4 of us, me, Alexei, Ivan, and Dmitri. We'd all grown up in the village nearby, and ice fishing was something we did every year. This lake, however, was different. It was deeper than most, almost unnaturally so, and the locals whispered strange stories about it. Stories about people disappearing, about shadows moving beneath the ice. But we were young, invincible. We laughed off the warnings and headed out early that morning, bundled up against the bitter cold. The lake was vast, a sheet of pristine white stretching as far as the eye could see. The ice was thick, nearly a meter in places, and the air was so cold it burned my lungs with every breath. We set up near the center of the lake, drilling holes into the ice and dropping our lines into the frigid water below. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light that made the ice shimmer. For the first few hours, it was uneventful. We drank vodka to keep warm, told stories, and laughed as Dmitri complained about the lack of fish. Felt like any other trip until we heard the knocking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo beneath the ice. I thought it was just the sound of the water shifting, but Alexei frowned, tilting his head to listen. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Probably just the ice settling," Ivan said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was knocking from beneath the ice. It moved, too, shifting from one hole to another, as if circling us. "Fish don't knock," Dmitri said, his eyes wide. Maybe it's the current, I offered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Alexei leaned over one of the holes, peering into the dark water below. There's something down there, he said. What do you see? Ivan asked. Alexei didn't answer. His face had gone pale, his breath fogging the air. Slowly, he backed away from the hole, his eyes never leaving the water. There's a face, he whispered. We crowded around the hole, our breath catching in our throats. First, I didn't see anything, just the rippling blackness of the water. But then it appeared, a pale, angular face pressed against the underside of the ice. Its eyes impossibly large and round, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Get back, Ivan said, grabbing Alexei's arm. Don't get too close. But Dmitri, ever the skeptic, shook his head. It's probably just a fish or something stuck under the ice. It's not a fish, Alexei said, his voice trembling. Dmitri ignored him, leaning closer to the hole. It's probably nothing. The face moved, its eyes locking onto Dmitri. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze, the sound of the wind and the tapping fading into an oppressive silence. And then the ice cracked. It happened so fast. One moment, Dmitri was leaning over the hole, his hand reaching for the ice. The next, something shot out of the water, a pale, clawed hand, impossibly long and thin. It grabbed his arm with inhuman strength, yanking him downward. He screamed, his legs kicking wildly as the ice splintered beneath him. Dmitri, Alexei shouted, grabbing his other arm. We all scrambled to pull him back, but whatever was beneath the ice was stronger. Dmitri's screams grew frantic as he was dragged closer to the hole, his feet slipping on the ice. Let go of him, Ivan shouted, pounding on the ice with his fists. The thing beneath the ice let out a sound, a high-pitched, otherworldly wail that pierced the air like a knife. Dmitri's screams turned into gurgles as his head dipped below the surface. And then he was gone, swallowed by the black water. We stared at the hole, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The ice around it was stained with blood, the water beneath still rippling. For a moment, none of us moved, our minds struggling to process what had just happened. Then the knocking started again. It was louder now, more insistent, coming from all around us. The ice groaned under our feet, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs. We grabbed our gear and ran, our boots slipping on the slick surface. The lake seemed alive, the knocking echoing beneath us like a heartbeat. When we reached the shore, we collapsed into the snow, gasping for air. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. The lake stretched out before us, calm and still, as if nothing had happened. What was that? Ivan whispered, his face pale. Alexei didn't answer. He was staring at the lake, his hands trembling. We have to go back for Dmitri, I said, though the words felt hollow. I knew he was gone. No, Alexei said, his voice flat. He's not there anymore. We returned to the village in silence, our minds reeling. When we told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. It wasn't until later, when I pressed one of the elders, that I got an answer. You shouldn't have gone to that lake, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. There are things in the ice, things older than us. They don't like to be disturbed. What are they? I asked, but she just shook her head. Pray you never find out. I haven't been back to that lake since. I still dream about it sometimes, about Dmitri's screams and the thing beneath the ice. I can still see its face, those impossibly large eyes staring at me through the darkness. People laugh when I tell them the story, call it a hallucination or a trick of the light. But I know the truth. There's something in those frozen lakes, something ancient and hungry. And if you ever hear knocking beneath the ice, do yourself a favor, don't look. Story number 7. The ghost train on the snow-covered tracks. There's a stretch of old railroad tracks outside Ashland, Wisconsin, buried deep in the woods. Most folks around here know better than to go near it during the winter, especially on snowy nights. They call it the silent line. Not because it's quiet, it's anything but. I didn't believe the stories. I wish I had. It was December 2019, and I was visiting my friend Mark. We hadn't seen each other in years, and I figured spending the holidays in a sleepy Wisconsin town would be a welcome break from the chaos of the city. Mark lived in an old farmhouse just outside of Ashland, surrounded by miles of woods and fields. On my second night there, a blizzard rolled in. The snow came down in heavy flakes, and the temperature plummeted. We were sitting by the fire, drinking beer and swapping stories, when Mark brought up the silent line. "You ever hear about the train accident out here back in the 20s?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. I shook my head, intrigued. "It was a passenger train," he said, "heading north during a snowstorm, just like this one. The tracks were iced over, and the brakes failed. The whole thing derailed, sent half the train into the woods. They say almost everyone on board died." "That's horrible," I said. Mark nodded, his expression dark. "Yeah, but that's not the end of it. People around here swear the train never really left. They say you can still hear it on snowy nights, the whistle, the sound of the wheels on the tracks. Some even claim they've seen it. An old steam engine lit up like it's still carrying passengers. But when they get close, it disappears." I laughed, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. "Come on, you don't really believe that, do you?" Mark didn't laugh. "I don't know what I believe, but I've heard it, Sam, late at night, when the snow's falling like this. I've heard it. That night, couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and Mark's story kept replaying in my head. At around midnight, I heard it, a faint, distant whistle. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time, cutting through the wind like a blade. My heart raced as I grabbed my coat and boots. I don't know why I felt the need to go out there, curiosity, maybe, or just plain stupidity. Either way, I wasn't about to let a ghost story get the better of me. The snow was knee-deep, and the cold stung my face as I made my way through the woods behind Mark's house. The wind carried the sound of the whistle, growing louder with every step. Eventually, I came to a clearing where the old railroad tracks cut through the trees. They were rusted and overgrown, the kind of tracks that hadn't seen a train in decades. But the sound was unmistakable. The whistle, the chugging of an engine, the clatter of wheels on steel, it was all there, growing louder, closer. Then I saw the light. First, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, but as it approached, it grew brighter, illuminating the snow-covered trees in an eerie yellow light. I stood frozen as the train came into view, a massive steam engine, its black body glistening with frost, pulling a line of passenger cars. The train slowed as it approached, its wheels screeching against the icy tracks. I could see figures inside the cars, silhouettes moving behind frosted windows. The whistle blew again, a mournful, haunting sound that seemed to echo through my bones. And then it stopped. The train came to a halt a few yards from where I stood, its massive engine hissing and steaming in the cold. The light from the headlamp bathed the clearing in a ghostly glow. I felt a strange pull, an urge to step closer, to climb aboard. The door to one of the passenger cars creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were like two black voids, empty and endless. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice low and raspy. I don't have one," I stammered, taking a step back. The conductor tilted his head, studying me with those empty eyes. "All aboard," he said, extending a hand. The cold around me deepened, the air so frigid it burned my lungs. I shook my head, stumbling backward as the pull grew stronger. The conductor's expression didn't change, but his voice grew louder, more insistent. "All aboard." The figures inside the train pressed against the windows now, their faces pale and gaunt, their mouths open in silent screams. The whistle blew again, deafeningly loud, and the light from the train intensified. Blinding me, I turned and ran. The snow dragged at my legs, and the wind howled like a living thing. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the whistle, the screech of the wheels, the hiss of steam. Felt like the train was right behind me, bearing down on me, ready to drag me into whatever hell it came from. When I finally stumbled back into Mark's house, I slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Mark was there, his face pale. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said. I nodded, too shaken to speak. The next morning, I went back to the tracks. The snow was untouched, pristine, except for one thing, a line of deep, parallel grooves cutting through the clearing, as if a train had passed through in the night. But there were no trains on that line. Not anymore. I left Ashland the next day, and I haven't been back since. But I can still hear it sometimes. In my dreams, the whistle, the clatter of the wheels, the mournful cry of a train that refuses to rest. If you ever find yourself near Ashland on a snowy night, and you hear that sound, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it, because once you see the train, it sees you too. Story number 8. The house buried in snow. Winters in the far north aren't just cold, they're consuming. The snow falls endlessly, piling higher and higher until it feels like the world itself is being swallowed. My family and I learned this the hard way during the winter of 1996. A winter so brutal that even the oldest residents of our small village in northern Finland said they'd never seen anything like it. It was the winter my brother disappeared. We lived in a cabin on the edge of the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. My father built it himself, sturdy and simple, meant to withstand the brutal winters that rolled in every year. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. A 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney that glowed warmly against the dark. Endless nights. Until that winter, it had always been enough. The snow started early that year, in late October. By November, it was already waist deep, and by December, it had reached the windows. My father spent hours every day shoveling paths around the house, trying to keep the front door clear, but the snow kept coming, and by January, we were completely buried. I mean that literally. The snow covered the house entirely, so deep and heavy that the windows were blocked, and the front door wouldn't budge. My father said it was fine, that we'd just have to dig our way out when the storm finally passed. But it didn't pass. The snow kept falling, and the cabin grew darker and colder with every passing day. That's when the sound started. First, it was just a faint scratching, like a tree branch brushing against the side of the house. We ignored it, chalking it up to the wind or the weight of the snow shifting. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. Probably just an animal, my father said, though his face was pale. "What kind of animal digs through snow this deep?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. My father didn't answer. The scratching turned to scraping, like claws dragging across the wooden walls. It moved around the house, circling, stopping sometimes at the windows or the door. We couldn't see anything. The snow outside was too thick, but we could hear it, and that was enough to keep us awake, clutching each other in the dark. One night, the sound changed. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was banging hard, deliberate blows against the walls and the roof, as if something was trying to get in. My father grabbed his rifle and stood by the front door, his jaw clenched. "Stay in the kitchen," he said, his voice firm. "Don't come out." We didn't argue. My mother, my brother Oscar, and I huddled together in the kitchen, listening as my father shouted into the darkness. "Who's out there?" he bellowed. "Show yourself." The banging stopped. For a moment, the cabin was deathly silent. And then, from somewhere deep in the snow, came a sound I'll never forget. It was a howl low, guttural, and impossibly loud. It didn't sound human. But it didn't sound like an animal, either. It was something in between, something ancient and hungry. The sound rattled the windows and made the walls creak, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. My father didn't sleep that night, and neither did we. The next morning, we found the first set of footprints. They were massive, at least twice the size of my father's boots, with long, clawed toes that dug deep into the snow. They circled the house, leading from the front door to the windows and back again. My father stared at them for a long time, his face unreadable. "It's not safe here," he said finally. "We need to leave." "How?" my mother asked. "We're buried alive. We'll dig." We spent the next few hours tunneling through the snow, carving out a narrow path to the surface. It was exhausting work, and the deeper we dug, the more oppressive the air felt. The walls of the tunnel seemed to press in on us, and the light filtering through the snow above was faint and cold. By the time we broke through to the surface, it was already getting dark. My father decided we'd wait until morning to make the trek to the village. "It's too dangerous to travel at night," he said. "We'll leave at first light." That night, the banging returned. It was louder this time, more violent. Whatever was out there wasn't just circling the house, it was trying to get in. The walls shook, the roof creaked, and the front door groaned under the weight of the blows. Oscar was the first to hear the voice. "It's calling me," he whispered, his face pale. "It knows my name." "What are you talking about?" my mother asked, her voice tight with fear. "Listen," Oscar said. We strained our ears, and for a moment, I thought he was imagining things. But then I heard it, a faint, whispering voice, drifting through the cracks in the walls. It was too soft to make out the words, but it was there, persistent and insistent. My father tried to block it out, stoking the fire and singing old folk songs to drown out the sound. But Oscar wouldn't stop staring at the door, his eyes wide and glassy. "It wants me to come outside," he said. "You're not going anywhere," my father snapped, gripping Oscar's shoulder. But later that night, while the rest of us were asleep, Oscar slipped out. I woke to my mother screaming. Oscar's bed was empty, his blankets thrown aside, and the front door was wide open. My father grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, calling Oscar's name. The rest of us followed, stumbling into the freezing darkness. The snow was deep, the wind biting, and the footprints were clear. They led from the house to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the shadows. "Oscar!" my father shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer, just the wind and the faint sound of something moving in the distance, something heavy and deliberate. We never found him. The villagers searched for weeks, but there was no sign of Oscar. No tracks, no body, nothing. They told us it was the storm, that he'd gotten lost in the snow. But I knew better. I'd seen the footprints circling the house. I'd heard the whispers, and I'd seen the thing standing at the edge of the woods that night, its massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight, its eyes glowing like embers. We moved away after that winter, but I still dream about that night, about the voice in the snow, the claw marks on the walls, and the footprints leading into the forest. And sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I think I hear it again, that low, guttural howl, rising from the depths of the snow. If you ever find yourself buried in a storm, and you hear scratching at the walls, don't open the door, because it's waiting. Story number 9. The Stranger in the Blizzard. Winter storms in Colorado aren't unusual, but the one in January 2013 was different. The snow came down in relentless sheets, the wind howling like a living thing. By the second day, the roads were impassable, and the power flickered off and on, leaving our house in an unsettling silence. It was just me, my wife Claire, and our 2 kids, Mia and Jake. The house was warm, the pantry stocked, and we weren't the type to scare easily. But that storm brought something with it, something that still haunts me to this day. The first night of the blizzard passed uneventfully. We huddled together in the living room, playing board games by candlelight as the wind screamed outside. The kids loved it, an adventure to break up the monotony of winter. By the second night, the storm had worsened. The windows rattled in their frames, and the snow had piled up so high against the doors that we knew we'd be stuck for days. The power went out just after dinner, plunging the house into darkness. We lit more candles and settled in for another long night. That's when the knocking started. First, I thought it was the wind, a branch tapping against the side of the house. But the sound was deliberate, rhythmic. 3 knocks, pause, then 3 more. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice low. I nodded, rising from my seat. The kids were already in their sleeping bags, drowsy from the warmth of the fire. "Stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight. I moved toward the front door, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The knocking came again, louder this time. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob, my breath visible in the cold air leaking through the frame. When I opened the door, the wind almost tore it from my hands. Snow swirled in the beam of the flashlight, and for a moment, I saw nothing but white. Then, out of the storm, a figure emerged. He stood just beyond the threshold, his body hunched against the wind. He was tall and thin, his frame hidden beneath a tattered coat. A hood covered his head, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, dark, piercing, and unrelenting. "Can I help you?" I called, my voice barely audible over the storm. He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, the snow swirling around him. "Do you need help?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The wind carried a sharp, bitter cold that made my skin crawl. Every instinct in me screamed to close the door, but I couldn't look away from him. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked into the storm, his movements slow and deliberate. The snow swallowed him up within seconds, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. Claire was waiting in the living room, her face pale. "Who was it?" she asked. I don't know," I said. "He didn't say anything, just left." "That's weird," she said, glancing toward the window. "Why would anyone be out in this storm?" "I don't know," I admitted, though the knot in my stomach told me there was more to it than that. We didn't sleep that night. The kids were blissfully unaware, but Claire and I sat by the fire, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the house. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the snow, his face hidden, his silence more unnerving than any scream. The next morning, the storm had eased, leaving the world buried in a thick blanket of white. I decided to check around the house, partly to clear my head and partly to assure myself that the night before had been nothing more than a strange encounter. But what I found made my blood run cold. The snow around the house was untouched except for a single set of footprints, large, deep impressions that circled the house. They didn't lead to the road or any discernible path. They simply started and ended at random points, as if the man had appeared and disappeared out of thin air. "Did you see these?" I called to Claire, my voice shaking. She stepped outside, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw the tracks. How does that make sense?" she whispered. "It doesn't," I said. "None of this makes sense." For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The snow reflected the sunlight so brightly it hurt my eyes, but every shadow, every distant tree, felt like it was hiding something. By the time night fell again, I was on edge. The wind had picked up once more, and the fire seemed to cast more shadows than light. Claire tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The kids, thankfully, were oblivious. And then the knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. 3 knocks, pause, then 3 more. I grabbed the flashlight and a fire poker, my hands trembling as I approached the door. "Don't open it," Claire whispered. "Please." But I had to. I couldn't just ignore it. When I opened the door, the storm roared in once more, but the figure wasn't there. Instead, the footprints were back, leading from the door into the darkness. I shone the flashlight into the night, but the beam revealed nothing. No man, no movement, just the endless snow and the howling wind. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The knocking came and went, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the back. Each time I checked, no one was there, just those damn footprints circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. When the storm finally broke and the roads were clear, we packed up and left, abandoning the house without a second thought. I don't know what I saw that night, or who or what was outside in the storm, but I know this: some things are better left unanswered, and some doors are better left unopened. Story number 10. The Haunted House in the Snow. Vermont winters are not for the faint of heart. The snow piles up until it feels like the whole world is buried, and the cold bites deep, wrapping itself around your bones. I moved to the small town of Harrow's End because I thought the quiet would be good for me, a place to escape the noise of the world. But I didn't know about the house, not until it was too late. The locals didn't talk about it much, but you could see the unease in their faces when it came up. Stay away from the old Barrett house. The bartender at the town's only pub had warned me my first week in town. He was a grizzled man, his voice as rough as the whiskey he poured. That place, it's not right. Why? I'd asked, curious but skeptical. Just don't, he said, his tone final. Especially not in winter. I should have listened. The Barrett house was just outside of town, a two-story farmhouse sitting alone in the middle of a snow-covered field. The road leading to it was barely more than a trail, and by December, it was nearly impassable. But that didn't stop the stories from spreading. Some said it was haunted by the ghost of Abigail Barrett, the last owner, who had died there alone in the winter of 1912. Others claimed it was something darker, something older than Abigail. But whatever it was, the house had a reputation. No one lived there, and few dared to go near it. I wasn't planning to, either, until the night of the storm. It was mid-January, and a blizzard had rolled in, the kind that makes the world disappear. The power went out early that evening, leaving my small rented cabin in darkness. I lit a few candles, stoked the fire, and tried to settle in for a long, cold night. Around midnight, I saw the light. It was faint at first, a flicker in the distance, but as I watched from my frosted window, it grew brighter. It was coming from the direction of the Barrett house. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the storm, moonlight reflecting off the snow. Maybe, but the light didn't waver, didn't move, stayed steady, glowing like a lantern in the middle of that empty field. Before I knew what I was doing, I was pulling on my coat and boots. Something about that light pulled at me, tugged at my curiosity until I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the storm. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, and the wind howled like a living thing, stinging my face and biting through my coat. It took me nearly an hour to reach the house, though it couldn't have been more than half a mile away. By the time I stood in front of it, my legs were trembling, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The Barrett house loomed before me, its dark silhouette stark against the snow. The light I'd seen was coming from the second floor, spilling faintly through the frosted window. It looked warm, inviting, and completely out of place in the abandoned house. I climbed the creaking steps to the porch, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The front door was slightly ajar, the wood swollen and splintered from years of neglect. As I pushed it open, a gust of icy wind blew past me, carrying the faint scent of decay. The inside of the house was worse than I'd imagined. The air was heavy, damp, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that hung like dead skin. Snow had drifted through the broken windows, pooling on the warped wooden floors. But the light from upstairs was steady, casting a faint glow down the staircase. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the icy floorboards. The air grew colder the farther I went, each step sending chills up my spine. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling around me. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They came from upstairs, slow, deliberate, the sound of boots on wood. My heart pounded as I stared at the staircase, the faint glow of the light spilling down like a beacon. I wanted to leave, to run back into the storm, but my feet wouldn't move. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I don't know what compelled me to climb those stairs, but I did. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the empty house. The light grew brighter as I neared the top, warm and golden, spilling from the open door of a room at the end of the hall. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The room was empty, but the light was there, coming from an old oil lamp sitting on a small table in the corner. The lamp burned steadily, its flame dancing in the cold air, though there was no sign of who had lit it. And then I saw her. She was standing by the window, her back to me, her figure faint and transparent in the lamplight. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair was pulled back in a loose bun. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't seem to notice me. "Abigail," I whispered, though I didn't know why. She turned slowly, her movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and her mouth twisted into a smile that made my stomach turn. She took a step toward me, and the room grew colder, the light dimming as if the flame was being smothered. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short. Panic gasped. The floor beneath me creaked, groaned, and then gave way. I fell hard, landing in a heap on the first floor. When I woke, the house was dark. The lamp was gone, and the light from upstairs had vanished. My flashlight was broken, its beam flickering weakly, and my leg throbbed with pain. I pulled myself to my feet. The memory of her face burned into my mind. The storm had died down, and I limped back to my cabin, the snow crunching underfoot. I didn't look back at the house. Couldn't. The next morning, I told the bartender what had happened. He listened quietly, his expression grim, and then poured me a shot of whiskey. "You're lucky," he said. "Most who see her don't come back." I left Harrow's End that spring, but I can't forget the Barrett house. I can't forget the sound of her footsteps, the way she smiled, or the cold that seemed to seep into my very soul. They say the house still stands, buried in snow, waiting for the next fool to wander in. If you ever see a light in the distance on a stormy night, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. Thank you for joining us on this bone-chilling journey through the eerie tales of snow and ice. From shadowy figures in Vermont cabins to ghost trains on snowy tracks. These stories remind us that winter's stillness often hides its own dark secrets. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, in the snow's embrace, not all shadows are what they seem.